People always wanted someone to blame for the end of the world. Some swore a virus leaked from a government lab. Others insisted a pharmaceutical company buried the truth after a failed experiment. I heard every theory imaginable during those first chaotic months, but eventually I stopped caring. None of those explanations ever filled an empty stomach, and none of them stopped the dead from ripping people apart. The only thing that mattered anymore was surviving, and survival depended on 3 simple rules. Stay quiet, stay alone, and never waste anything. Death had become unpredictable. Some people stayed dead. Others came back, sometimes minutes later, sometimes hours. Nobody understood why. Some believed the ones who returned had died angry, or simply weren't ready to let go. Maybe that was nonsense. All I knew was that dying didn't guarantee you stayed dead anymore. Once they came back, though, the rules were simple. Destroy the brain and they stayed down. Anything else only slowed them down. The world I grew up in didn't die loudly. Just faded. Neighborhoods that once echoed with children laughing had become graveyards of abandoned homes and shattered windows. Cars sat rusting in the middle of roads where desperate people had tried to escape, their doors still hanging open like frozen screams. Billboards advertised futures that no longer existed. Thick gray clouds smothered the sky, and the smell of damp earth mixed with decay had become so constant that I barely noticed it anymore. That afternoon had gone better than I expected. I stepped out of an old Victorian house with my backpack heavier than when I'd entered. I had watched that place from a distance for nearly a week before deciding to risk it. Houses that looked untouched usually hid one of 2 things. Either another survivor had already stripped them clean, or something inside had made sure nobody else wanted to go in. I took the chance anyway, and for once, luck didn't spit in my face. The pantry was almost untouched. Whoever lived there must have stocked enough food to last months before everything collapsed. Shelves still held canned vegetables, soup, beans, bottled water, even a few boxes of crackers that survived hungry scavengers. Every can I slipped into my backpack meant another meal, and another meal meant another sunrise. In the world I lived in, tomorrow was worth more than money had ever been. But even after finding enough supplies to make the trip worthwhile, something about the house kept bothering me. The silence felt wrong. Old homes usually groaned when the wind pushed against them, and loose floorboards almost always creaked beneath your feet. This place was different. It was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat echoing inside the hallway. I stopped walking because the hairs on the back of my neck suddenly stood up. I couldn't explain why, but I felt watched, not by a person but by the house itself. Then I heard it. Something dragged across the floor above me. I froze. A few seconds later, slow footsteps scraped across the hardwood. They weren't normal footsteps. One foot dragged while the other stumbled forward, creating a slow, uneven rhythm that immediately told me I wasn't alone. Curiosity kills people just as fast as stupidity, usually faster. I climbed the staircase one silent step at a time until I could see into one of the upstairs bedrooms without exposing myself completely. The moment I looked through the doorway, I understood why nobody had looted the house before me. An elderly woman wandered the bedroom in a slow, mindless loop. She still wore what had once been an elegant dress, though most of the fabric had rotted into filthy strips that clung to her like wet paper. Her pale skin had turned the color of old ash, and much of the flesh along one side of her face had decayed away, exposing cracked teeth stained nearly black. Wisps of white hair clung to her scalp while her cloudy eyes drifted across the room without focusing on anything at all. Every few steps she released a wet, rasping sound, not breathing, not moaning, just air escaping something that no longer remembered how lungs worked. She wasn't searching for food. She wasn't hunting. She simply walked the same path over and over again, trapped inside whatever final moment her mind had died in. I had already found everything I came for, and I knew better than to fight unless there was absolutely no other choice. Every unnecessary fight carried 2 risks: getting bitten or making enough noise to attract everything within hearing distance. Neither outcome was worth another can of food. I backed away from the bedroom, placing each foot exactly where it had been before. My heart hammered so loudly I was convinced she could hear it, but somehow she never looked toward the hallway. I reached the staircase without making a sound, slipped down each step one at a time, and quietly opened the rear door. The cold evening air hit my face like a warning. For the first time in several minutes, I finally allowed myself to breathe. I adjusted the straps on my backpack and started across the gravel driveway, already planning where I'd spend the night. I had barely taken a dozen steps when I heard a low growl behind me. The sound wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Every instinct I had screamed that I had reacted a second too late. I slowly turned around and immediately wished I hadn't. One of the infected stood less than 10 feet away, staring at me through cloudy white eyes that no longer held any trace of the man it used to be. Most of its lower lip had rotted away, leaving yellowed teeth permanently exposed. Dried blood covered its chin and neck, and the fingers reaching toward me ended in cracked, broken nails caked with dirt and old flesh. The smell reached me before it moved. It was a nauseating mixture of rotting meat, damp clothing, and decay that seemed to coat the inside of my throat with every breath. The infected lunged without warning. I threw myself backward just before its teeth snapped shut where my face had been. My pistol rested on my hip, but firing it would have been the worst decision I could make. One gunshot could attract every infected within several blocks, and I wasn't about to trade one problem for 20 more. I reached for the knife on my belt instead and waited for another opening. The creature charged again with surprising speed. I stepped to the side and drove my shoulder into its chest, hoping to throw it off balance, but its dead weight crashed into me anyway. We both slammed into the gravel, and before I could recover, it was already crawling over me. Its mouth snapped wildly only inches from my face while strands of dark saliva dripped from broken teeth. I shoved my forearm against its throat with every bit of strength I had, desperately trying to keep those teeth away from my neck. Its fingernails scraped across my jacket as it clawed at my chest, and one terrifying thought kept repeating inside my head. All it takes is one bite. One bite was enough to erase everything I had survived. My knife hand finally broke free. I drove the blade into the side of its skull. The first strike slowed it, but it didn't stop. I pulled the knife free and stabbed again. The infected jerked violently, spraying dark, foul-smelling blood across my sleeve, yet it continued snapping its jaws only inches from my face. I gritted my teeth, forced my arm underneath its body, and buried the knife into its head a third time with every ounce of strength I had left. This time I felt the blade punch through bone. The infected immediately went limp. For several seconds I remained on the ground, breathing so hard that my chest burned. The corpse lay across me like a sack of wet concrete until I shoved it aside and scrambled backward. Before doing anything else, I checked my arms, neck, hands, and face for scratches or bite marks. Finding none, I wiped the knife clean on the infected's torn clothing before sliding it back into its sheath. I didn't waste another second. If that struggle had attracted anything else, I wanted to be somewhere else before they arrived. The nearest woods sat only a few hundred yards away, and I reached them just as darkness swallowed the last traces of daylight. I had spent enough nights sleeping outside to know that comfort didn't keep people alive. Preparation did. I searched until I found a large oak tree with thick roots that provided a little cover, then collected dry twigs and scattered them in a wide circle around my sleeping spot. It wasn't much of an alarm system, but anyone or anything trying to sneak up on me would have to step on them first. That tiny crack of breaking wood had saved my life more than once. After setting the final twig in place, I shrugged off my backpack and leaned against the tree. Tucked near the bottom was a bottle of expensive whiskey I'd been carrying for months. I stared at it for a long time before twisting off the cap. I knew drinking alone in the middle of the woods wasn't smart. Alcohol dulled your senses, slowed your reactions, and made people careless. I'd seen survivors die because they thought one peaceful night meant they could finally relax. Some nights the silence was harder to survive than the dead. I raised the bottle and took a slow swallow. The warmth spread through my chest, reminding me of a life that felt like it belonged to somebody else. I remembered warm houses, crowded restaurants, and people laughing over drinks because tomorrow was something they expected instead of something they hoped for. I let out a tired laugh and looked toward the dark sky hidden behind the trees. "Here's to the apocalypse," I muttered. "You finally got everything you wanted." I took one final drink before sealing the bottle and putting it away. Getting drunk out there would have been suicide, and I had survived far too long to throw my life away over a bottle. Exhaustion eventually won. I rested my head against the tree, listened to the wind moving through the branches overhead, and closed my eyes. I have no idea how long I slept. A deep, guttural snarl ripped me awake. My eyes flew open and every muscle in my body tightened at once. One of the infected was charging straight toward me through the darkness. Most of its face had rotted away, exposing yellowed teeth and strips of muscle beneath gray skin. One eye hung loosely from its socket, swinging with every violent step as it barreled toward me. I reached for my knife, but it was already too close. For the first time in a long time, I honestly believed I wasn't going to survive. Then I heard a young voice shout from somewhere behind the creature. "Get down. Don't touch him." A rifle cracked through the forest. The bullet tore through the infected's head with devastating force, throwing its body backward before it collapsed only a few feet from where I had been sleeping. For a brief moment, the forest fell completely silent again, and I found myself staring at the corpse, trying to understand how a stranger had just saved my life. I slowly turned toward the direction of the gunshot, still gripping my knife, wondering whether I had just been rescued, or whether I had stumbled into an entirely different kind of danger. For several seconds after the infected collapsed, I couldn't move. I just stood there, staring at the body twitching in the dirt while my heartbeat clawed its way back down from my throat. If that girl hadn't fired when she did, I would have been another nameless corpse feeding the soil. Survival usually came down to experience, preparation, and a little luck. That night, Luck arrived wearing a torn jacket and carrying a hunting rifle almost too big for her hands. The first thing I noticed wasn't how young she looked. It was how she held the rifle. Her hands trembled from the recoil, but the barrel stayed fixed on the edge of the woods. She knew enough to understand that one infected rarely wandered alone. She couldn't have been older than 13 or 14, yet there wasn't any panic in her eyes. Panic is loud. Panic gets you killed. What she had was fear, sharp, controlled, useful. She offered me a nervous smile before quietly saying, "Hello, mister. You were really close to becoming food." I let out a tired laugh, the kind that comes from relief and exhaustion tangled together. "I appreciate the timing," I told her. "You probably saved my life." Before she could answer, another voice drifted out of the darkness. A man stepped into view, moving like someone who had survived too many nights just like this one. Deep scars carved across one side of his face, and his eyes never stopped scanning the woods. He looked at me once before taking the rifle from the girl's hands, reminding her she couldn't keep running off alone. More importantly, he reminded her that firing a rifle in the middle of the woods was an easy way to invite every infected within earshot to dinner. He wasn't wrong. The girl apologized, explaining she saw the infected standing over me and reacted before thinking. The older man sighed, shook his head, and finally introduced himself as Charles. I introduced myself in return, though I kept it short. The less strangers knew about me, the better. That rule had kept me alive almost as long as staying quiet. Charles studied me for several seconds before asking where I was headed. "The same place everyone else is," I answered. "Tomorrow." He actually smiled at that, a small, tired thing that didn't reach his eyes. The girl introduced herself as Sophie and immediately asked if I wanted to travel with them. Charles didn't like the idea. He admitted he didn't trust strangers, especially now that the world had turned into a place where trust was worth less than ammunition. Sophie argued that 3 people stood a better chance than 2 and reminded him he was always talking about strength in numbers. I listened to them go back and forth before deciding to settle the argument myself. "I'll walk with you for a while," I said. "Just don't mistake that for me joining your group." Charles accepted the compromise without another complaint, and the 3 of us slipped deeper into the woods. The entire walk felt uncomfortable. Charles stayed several yards ahead while Sophie remained between us, almost as though he was making sure she was never alone with me. I didn't take it personally. If I had been responsible for protecting a kid in a world like this, I would have done the same thing, maybe worse. As we walked, I quietly studied both of them. Sophie still carried herself like a normal kid despite everything she'd lived through. Every now and then she'd stop to look at something in the woods or ask Charles a question that would have sounded perfectly ordinary before the world ended. She hadn't lost her innocence yet. Not completely. And I found myself hoping she never would, even though I knew the world would take it from her eventually. Charles was different. He rarely spoke unless he had something necessary to say. Every few minutes he'd stop, scan the woods behind us, then continue walking without a word. He wasn't paranoid. He was seasoned. There was a difference. Paranoia wastes energy. Experience saves it. After nearly an hour, Charles led us into a small clearing hidden beneath a thick canopy of trees. Fallen logs surrounded the area, making it almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. "This should work for tonight," Charles said quietly. None of us argued. Finding a place to sleep without becoming someone else's meal counted as a successful day. The woods fell into a suffocating silence after we settled into the clearing. Charles never bothered with a campfire. Fire was a luxury for people who still believed the world cared whether they lived or died. Out here, flame wasn't warmth, it was a beacon. It told every hungry thing exactly where you were sleeping. So we ate in the dark, opening cold cans with careful, deliberate movements while the last traces of daylight bled out behind the trees. Sophie tried to keep the conversation alive. She asked where I'd come from, how long I'd been on my own, whether I had any family left. I answered only enough to be polite. In this world, the less people knew about you, the easier it was to vanish if you ever needed to. Charles didn't seem bothered by my silence. If anything, he seemed to appreciate it. After we finished eating, Sophie leaned against her backpack and introduced herself properly. She told me she'd been searching for her older brother ever since a massive herd tore through their neighborhood. Charles had found her wandering alone days later and had been helping her ever since. As she talked, I noticed Charles quietly looking away whenever she mentioned her brother. Not enough to accuse him of anything, but enough to make me pay attention. Survival had taught me one rule more important than any other. Watch what people do when they think no one is looking. Eventually Charles stood and suggested we get some sleep. Sophie looked disappointed when she realized I wasn't planning to stay with them any longer than necessary. Charles reminded her that trusting strangers wasn't a luxury anyone could afford anymore. He didn't look at me when he said it, but he didn't need to. I didn't disagree. Truthfully, I didn't trust either of them. Before lying down, I quietly set my pistol beneath my blanket where I could reach it without anyone noticing. Old habits had kept me alive, and I wasn't about to abandon them because I'd shared one meal with two strangers. The forest settled into an uneasy stillness. Somewhere in the distance, an infected groaned, a low, hollow sound that drifted through the trees before fading into silence again. Sophie fell asleep first. Charles followed not long after, or at least he wanted me to believe he had. I closed my eyes and slowed my breathing until it sounded like I was asleep too, but I never let myself drift. Sleeping around strangers was a gamble I had no interest in taking. Hours passed before I heard movement. Sophie quietly woke Charles and whispered that she needed to step away for a moment. Charles told her not to wander far before she disappeared into the darkness between the trees. The moment she was gone, every instinct I had started screaming. Charles slowly stood up. He didn't check the woods. He didn't look for infected. He didn't even glance in Sophie's direction. He walked toward me. I kept my breathing slow while my hand rested inches from the pistol beneath my blanket. Through barely opened eyes, I watched him stop beside me. He leaned down just enough to study my face, his expression unreadable in the darkness. "Hey pal, you awake?" I didn't answer. For a brief second, neither of us moved. Then he raised his pistol. The muzzle flashed. The impact hit my chest like a sledgehammer, ripping the air out of my lungs and sending me rolling onto my side. Pain detonated through my ribs as I fought to breathe. Every instinct told me I should already be dead, yet somehow I wasn't. Charles didn't bother checking. Convinced the bullet had done its job, he slipped into the trees without a word, disappearing into the same darkness Sophie had walked into moments earlier. Several minutes passed before I managed to sit upright. My chest burned with every breath and my ears rang from the gunshot. When I finally pulled my jacket open, the truth stared back at me. The bullet had flattened against the ceramic plate inside my vest. The impact felt like getting kicked by a horse, but the vest had saved my life. I looked toward the darkness where Charles had vanished. People always said the dead were the monsters. They were wrong. Sometimes the living were far worse. It took several minutes before I could stand without feeling like my ribs were folding inward. The ceramic plate inside my vest had stopped the bullet, but it hadn't spared me the agony. Every breath felt like someone was driving a rusted spike into my chest. I forced myself to ignore it. Pain meant I was still alive, and being alive meant I still had a chance to fix the mistake I'd made. I had trusted Charles enough to sleep within a few feet of him. That mistake wasn't happening again. I gathered my backpack, checked my pistol, and scanned the campsite. Charles hadn't bothered covering his tracks. He'd left in a hurry because he believed I was dead. That was his first mistake. The second was taking Sophie with him. I followed the trail through the woods as the first hints of dawn pushed against the darkness. Broken branches, fresh boot prints, and disturbed patches of dirt were easy to spot once I slowed down and paid attention. Charles wasn't traveling alone anymore either. Smaller footprints wove beside his, Sophie's, which meant she was still on her feet for at least part of the journey. That gave me hope. But hope in this world was a fragile thing. It cracked easily. About an hour later, the trail changed. The footprints became uneven, and long grooves appeared in the dirt as though something heavy had been dragged through the forest. I crouched beside one of the marks and ran my fingers across the disturbed soil. Someone had been resisting. The farther I followed the trail, the angrier I became. The woods felt colder. The air tasted stale, like rot drifting between the trees. Even the birds had gone silent, as if they didn't want to witness whatever waited ahead. The trail eventually opened into a clearing where an old cabin leaned to one side, sagging under years of neglect. Most of the windows were boarded shut, and the porch looked ready to collapse under its own weight. It looked abandoned, but in the apocalypse, abandoned usually meant claimed by something worse. I approached from the rear, keeping low and moving slowly enough that even the leaves barely whispered beneath my boots. Voices drifted through one of the broken windows. I eased myself closer until I could see inside. Charles stood near a small fire with two other men I had never seen before. The firelight made their faces look warped, stretched, almost inhuman. One had a thick build, shaved head, short beard, and black jacket. The other was younger, thinner, and carried himself with the kind of confidence that came from believing the world existed only to feed him. Then I saw Sophie. She was tied to a wooden chair with her hands secured behind her back. A filthy rag had been shoved into her mouth, and dry tears streaked the dirt on her cheeks. Her hair was tangled, her face pale, her breathing shallow. The moment our eyes met, I felt her relief. I slowly shook my head. Not yet. She understood. The three men kept talking, completely unaware I was only a few feet away. The larger man glanced toward Charles. What about the roadkill? Charles shrugged. Still back at the clearing. I had Sophie with me. Wasn't dragging him through the woods while trying to get her back here. The younger man looked surprised. You just left him there? I figured we'd go back for him, Charles said. 3 of us can carry him easier than 1. The larger man frowned. You sure he's dead? Charles gave a quiet laugh. I put a bullet through his chest. What do you think? My hand instinctively moved toward the ceramic plate beneath my jacket. They were talking about me. Charles hadn't left me behind because he was in a hurry. He'd left me there because he planned on coming back for my body. The thought made my stomach turn. The younger man looked toward Sophie and laughed, a hollow, ugly sound that didn't belong to anything human. She's a pretty little thing, he said. Seems like a waste not to have some fun before breakfast. My grip tightened around my pistol until my knuckles ached. Charles looked at him with open disgust. You've got a sick mind, he said. I'm talking about food. You start thinking with anything besides survival and you'll end up dead. The larger man burst into laughter. Nobody wants to eat leftovers anyway. All 3 laughed. Sophie lowered her head and squeezed her eyes shut, her shoulders trembling. I felt my pulse pounding inside my ears, drowning out everything else. Whatever sympathy I might have had for Charles evaporated in that moment. He hadn't rescued Sophie. He'd hunted her. I checked my pistol one last time and quietly counted the rounds in the magazine. 3 men, 1 little girl, and a world that didn't care who lived or died. There wasn't a decision to make anymore. I took one slow breath, stepped away from the window and walked toward the front door. If I waited any longer, Sophie wasn't walking out of that cabin alive. I tightened my grip around the pistol and took one slow breath before stepping onto the porch. The old boards groaned beneath my boots like the cabin itself was warning me to turn back. But there was no turning back. Not now. Not after what I'd seen. The moment I reached the front door, I drove my shoulder into it with everything I had. The door didn't just open, it detonated inward. Every head inside the cabin snapped toward me. Charles's eyes widened, not with fear, but with the sick realization that the dead man he'd left behind had come walking back into his life. He had abandoned me in the dirt hours earlier, and judging by the look on his face, seeing me standing there felt like seeing a ghost. I didn't waste the advantage. My pistol came up and I fired before anyone else had time to react. The shot hit Charles square in the chest, knocking him backward across the room. He crashed behind an old table, gasping like a man drowning on dry land. The thinner man reached for the handgun tucked into his waistband. He never made it. I fired again. The round hit him high in the chest and he staggered into the wall before collapsing onto the floor, clutching at nothing, choking on nothing, dying for nothing. The cabin erupted into chaos. Sophie cried through the rag tied around her mouth, her voice muffled and broken. The larger man didn't reach for a weapon. He charged me instead, moving with the kind of blind rage that didn't care whether he lived or died. He slammed into me with enough force to send my pistol skidding across the floor. We crashed into a broken table, splintering the wood beneath us. He drove a heavy fist into the side of my face, and bright flashes burst across my vision. Another punch caught me across the jaw, rattling my skull. Pain roared through me, but years of surviving had taught me one truth. If you stop moving, you die. I wrapped both arms around his waist and drove him backward into the fireplace. Bricks cracked and crumbled around us as we hit the stone. I managed to throw him off balance long enough to land 2 hard punches of my own, but they barely slowed him down. He answered with an elbow that split my lip and sent blood running down my chin. He smiled. Not a human smile. Something hollow and evil. He climbed on top of me and raised both hands, preparing to drive them down into my throat. His shadow swallowed the firelight, turning him into a silhouette of violence. Then a gunshot tore through the cabin. His body jerked violently. For a second he looked confused, like his mind couldn't understand what had happened. Then he collapsed across my chest, heavy and limp. I shoved him aside and looked toward the far side of the room. Charles was still alive. He leaned against the wall with a pistol in his hand, breathing through blood-coated teeth. His face twisted into something hateful. "Damn it, Billy," he growled. "You got in the way." So Billy hadn't been worth saving. He had only been standing in the wrong place. Charles slowly raised the pistol toward me again. This time I was faster. I rolled across the floor, grabbed my own pistol, and came up on one knee just as Charles pulled the trigger. His shot shattered the window behind me, spraying broken glass across the room like icy rain. Mine struck him squarely in the chest. He stumbled backward. I fired again. The second bullet hit just below his collarbone, driving him against the wall. His pistol slipped from his hand and he slowly slid to the floor, leaving a dark smear behind him. The cabin fell silent except for my breathing, ragged, uneven, alive. For several seconds I kept my weapon trained on Charles, waiting for him to move again. He never did. I drew my hunting knife and made absolutely certain none of them would ever get back up. My hand tightened around the grip until my knuckles turned white. I found myself driving the blade down again and again, long after necessity had given way to anger. It took me several seconds to realize what I was doing. I forced myself to stop, took a slow breath, and got a grip before checking the other two men just as carefully, making sure none of them had one last breath left to spend. Only then did I hear Sophie. Her muffled cries had become quiet, shaking sobs. I crossed the cabin, removed the filthy rag from her mouth, and cut through the ropes binding her wrists. The moment she was free, she threw her arms around me and cried into my shoulder, trembling so hard I could feel it through my jacket. I didn't know what to say. There wasn't anything to say. I just held her until she finally pulled away and wiped her face with shaking hands. When I looked around the cabin one last time, the truth settled over me like a weight I'd been carrying for years. The infected weren't the only monsters left in the world. Sometimes the ones still breathing were far worse. Morning light spilled through the broken windows of the cabin, slicing across the floorboards like pale blades. Dust drifted through the beams, swirling above the bodies that lay where they had fallen. The smell of burnt gunpowder clung to the air, mixing with the sour stench of fear and sweat. Surviving a fight didn't feel like winning. It felt like waking up inside the aftermath of a nightmare. Sophie stood beside one of the windows, staring at the floor instead of the dead men around us. Her voice finally broke the silence, thin and cracked. She admitted Charles had convinced her they were traveling to a place where her brother was waiting. She said she couldn't believe she trusted him so easily. There wasn't anger in her voice anymore, just disappointment so heavy it sounded like grief. I understood that feeling better than she realized. She thanked me for coming back. I looked at her for a long moment before answering. "You already saved my life once," I said. "I wasn't about to let those bastards take yours." For the first time since we'd met, a faint smile touched her face, fragile, exhausted, barely there. I slung my backpack over one shoulder and started toward the front door. "I've got to keep moving," I told her. "You'll be safer staying here than following me." The smile vanished instantly. She hurried after me, her voice trembling as she asked how I could expect a kid to survive alone after everything that had happened. She reminded me Charles had betrayed her, her brother was still missing, and I was the only person left she believed she could trust. I stopped walking but didn't turn around. "The first lesson you need to learn," I said quietly, "is that trust gets people killed. Don't trust strangers. Don't trust friendly faces. Don't even trust me. Learn to secure this cabin, ration your food, and stay alive." She asked if I really planned to leave her there. Before I could answer, something interrupted us. A faint sound drifted through the morning air. A whimper. I slowly raised my hand, signaling for Sophie to stay silent. The sound came again. Not from the woods. From behind the cabin. I drew my pistol and stepped outside. Sophie followed close behind despite every instinct telling her not to. We rounded the corner until an old wooden shed came into view. The doors were secured with a heavy padlock that looked newer than everything around it. The crying grew louder. Whatever was making that sound was trapped inside. I tested the lock before looking back toward the cabin. They've got to have a key somewhere, I said. Sophie looked at the corpses, then back at me. You want me to search them? She hesitated for a moment before glancing toward the cabin again. At least walk back with me. I nodded. We headed back toward the cabin together. Her hands shook so badly she nearly dropped the first ring of keys twice. The second body carried another set. The third had one more hanging from his belt. By the time we found all three, Sophie was breathing hard and trying not to look at their faces. I gathered the keys and we walked back toward the shed together. I started trying them one at a time. While I worked, Sophie quietly admitted that Charles had at least pretended to be kind. I stopped turning the key long enough to look at her. Predators usually do. She lowered her eyes. I handed one of the pistols we'd recovered to her. The next time you search a body, I said, look for weapons before you look for keys. Food runs out. Ammunition runs out. A weapon might be the only reason you get another chance. She nodded without arguing. The fourth key slid into the lock. A loud click echoed through the yard. The smell hit us before the doors were fully open. It rolled out of the shed like a living thing, thick, sour, suffocating. Rotting flesh. Old blood. Human waste. Hopelessness made physical. Even after everything I'd seen since the world collapsed, I almost stepped backward. Inside, the shed looked less like a storage building and more like a grave someone had forgotten to finish. Bodies had been thrown into piles without the slightest concern for who they had once been. Limbs lay scattered across the dirt floor. Dried blood coated the walls in dark stains. Flies buzzed through the stale air while maggots writhed across exposed flesh. Near the back of the room, two mutilated people hung upside down from heavy chains fastened to the ceiling. Their legs had been amputated below the knees. Most of their blood had already drained away. Yet somehow, they were still moving. Weak, desperate whimpers escaped through cracked lips while cloudy eyes drifted across the room without recognition. They weren't alive anymore. They had already turned. The transformation had simply been slowed by the horrific condition their bodies were in, trapped between life and death, suffering in a way no one should ever suffer. Sophie stepped beside me before I could stop her. One look inside was enough. She stumbled backward, covered her mouth, and fought to keep from vomiting. Tears filled her eyes as she whispered that she wanted to leave. I couldn't blame her. So do I answered quietly. We gathered every weapon, every can of food, every box of ammunition, and every useful supply we could carry. Before leaving, I searched the cabin one final time. Folded inside a kitchen drawer was a crude hand-drawn map. One location had been circled before someone scratched a heavy X across it. Next to the mark, someone had written two words: Survivors Camp. I folded the map and slipped it into my backpack. Whether that place still existed or not, it was the only lead either of us had left. Without another look at the cabin, Sophie and I disappeared into the trees together. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't surviving alone anymore. The forest slowly disappeared behind us as we followed the faded map deeper into unfamiliar territory. Neither of us spoke during the first few hours. The cabin, the bodies, the shed, the horror, still clung to us like a shadow we couldn't outrun. Every step felt heavier than the last. I wasn't used to traveling with someone else. For years, every decision I made affected only me. If I wanted to take a risk, I took it. If I wanted to change direction, I changed it. Now every mile forced me to think about someone else's survival, and I hated how quickly that responsibility had settled into my bones. Sophie eventually broke the silence. She asked what my life had been like before everything fell apart. What job I had, whether I had a family, what I missed most about the old world. I didn't answer right away. Some memories rot the longer you carry them. I worked construction, I finally said. Nothing glamorous. Long hours, sore muscles, never enough money. Back then I thought I had real problems. I gave a quiet laugh, the kind that didn't feel like laughter at all. I trade every bad day back then for one ordinary morning now. Sophie smiled sadly. I barely remember what ordinary felt like. Her words hit harder than she knew. She was too young to lose an entire world. As we walked, she pulled a worn photograph from her jacket pocket. The picture showed a teenage boy with his arm around her shoulders. Both of them were smiling, unaware of the future waiting to swallow them whole. "That's my brother," she said. "I know he's still alive." I studied the photograph before handing it back. "I hope you're right." She tucked it away carefully. "You don't sound convinced." "I've learned not to promise people things I can't control." She nodded, but disappointment flickered across her face. Hope was a fragile thing, and she was carrying more of it than the world deserved. The trail narrowed until we found an old campsite hidden beneath the trees. A weathered tent still stood in the center of the clearing. The zipper was closed. That alone made my stomach tighten. Most abandoned camps had been torn apart by scavengers or shredded by storms. This one looked untouched, preserved, almost waiting. I motioned for Sophie to stay behind me. "If anything moves," I said quietly, "run." She didn't argue. I slowly pulled the zipper open. Inside were two bodies lying side by side in sleeping bags. Their hands were still intertwined. Between them rested an empty bottle of prescription pills. No bite marks. No blood. No struggle. Just two people who had decided the world had taken enough from them. A folded note rested on one of their chests. I unfolded it carefully. They had been married for 34 years. Rather than spend their anniversary watching each other starve or turn, they had chosen to leave the world together while they still recognized one another. I folded the letter and placed it back where I found it. Some people survived by fighting. Others survived long enough to choose how their story ended. Neither choice felt fair. Sophie quietly asked what I'd found. I looked back toward the tent before answering. Two people who loved each other enough to leave together. She lowered her head. Neither of us spoke. We continued walking as the afternoon faded toward evening. For a while, all I could hear were our footsteps and the wind pushing through the trees. The silence felt heavier than before, like the forest itself was grieving. Eventually the woods gave way to abandoned streets and crumbling buildings. The city stood ahead of us like the skeleton of a civilization that had forgotten it was dead. I unfolded the map one more time. If the markings were accurate, our destination wasn't much farther away. The closer we moved toward the city, the slower I walked. Buildings created blind corners. Abandoned vehicles blocked escape routes. Every shattered storefront and every dark alley offered another place for the infected to wait without being seen. Out in the woods, danger usually announced itself. Cities were different. Cities killed people who forgot how quickly hope could turn into a trap. I motioned for Sophie to stay close. "Step where I step," I told her. "Don't touch anything unless I tell you to, and if we have to run, don't stop to look behind you." She nodded without asking questions. That was another change I'd noticed. The girl who once questioned everything was beginning to understand that hesitation wasn't curiosity, it was death wearing a different mask. We worked our way between rusted vehicles and shattered storefronts. Wind pushed scraps of newspaper across the cracked pavement while old traffic lights swayed overhead, their faded colors meaningless in a world with no one left to obey them. The silence felt wrong. Cities were never truly quiet. Even after the outbreak, there was always something. A distant groan, breaking glass, the shuffle of feet somewhere beyond the next intersection. This place had none of it. Not a whisper. Not a breath. Not a single sign of life. That made my skin crawl. As we passed an overturned pickup truck, movement exploded from behind it. An infected lunged toward Sophie. Its jaw hung crooked from an old injury, and strips of gray flesh dangled from its face as it reached for her with blood-stained hands. Its eyes were cloudy, unfocused, but its hunger was unmistakable. There wasn't enough time to use my knife. I fired. The shot struck the infected in the forehead, snapping its head backward before the body collapsed only a few feet from Sophie. She stood frozen. I grabbed her arm. She didn't argue. The echo of the gunshot rolled through the empty streets, bouncing off concrete and broken glass until it faded into the distance. Then the answering sounds began. One groan, then another, then dozens. The noise spread through the city like a sickness waking up. I looked toward the far end of the street and felt my stomach tighten. The infected were coming. They poured out of alleyways, stumbled through broken doorways, and climbed over abandoned cars with a single purpose. Some limped on shattered legs. Others dragged ruined arms behind them. Their vacant eyes searched relentlessly until the sound of my gunshot guided them in our direction. There were too many. No amount of ammunition was getting us through that. I scanned the street desperately until I spotted an old delivery truck parked beside a loading dock. "Come on." We sprinted toward it. I boosted Sophie into the cargo bed first before sliding underneath the truck myself. There wasn't enough room for both of us below the frame, and if the infected looked into the open bed, we were finished. "Stay completely still," I whispered. She lay flat without making a sound. Seconds later, the first infected shuffled past. Then another. Soon there were hundreds. Rotting feet scraped across the pavement only inches from my face. The smell was unbearable, decay, mildew, and something sour that clung to the air like poison. Thick drops of dark saliva splattered onto the asphalt beside me as countless bodies passed overhead. Several stopped so close I could hear their ragged breathing, One infected stopped directly next to the truck. Its bare feet turned slowly until they faced my direction. I tightened my grip around the pistol. If it crouched down, if it looked underneath, it was over. The infected remained perfectly still for several long seconds. Then another groan echoed somewhere farther down the street. Its head jerked toward the sound. Without another pause, it shuffled away to rejoin the herd. I didn't move. Neither did Sophie. Nearly 15 minutes passed before the last of the infected disappeared into the maze of abandoned buildings. Only then did I crawl out from beneath the truck. My shirt clung to my back with sweat despite the cool air. I helped Sophie climb down from the cargo bed. She looked pale, but she was still standing. "I thought we were dead," she whispered. "So did I." Before either of us could speak again, the metallic groan of heavy gates echoed across the empty street. We both turned. At the far end of the block, a tall chain-link gate slowly swung inward. Behind it stood several young soldiers with rifles aimed directly at us. None of them fired. None of them spoke. They simply watched. For the first time in days, it looked like we had finally found other survivors. Neither of us realized we were about to walk straight into the worst mistake we'd made since leaving that cabin. The gate continued opening until there was just enough room for us to step through. Neither of us moved. After Charles, trusting strangers felt like stepping into a trap with our eyes open. The young men behind the fence kept their rifles trained on us, but their fingers rested outside the triggers. That told me they had discipline. Nervous people strangled the trigger. Trained people didn't. One of them finally spoke. He asked whether either of us had been bitten. I shook my head and answered for both of us. No. He studied us for several long seconds, not to confirm our safety, but to decide whether we were worth letting in. Only then did he lower his rifle. "Then come inside. We can get you both cleaned up and fed." It had been days since either of us had eaten anything warm. Sophie looked at me, and for the first time since I'd met her, hope flickered across her face like a dying flame trying to come back to life. That alone made the decision harder. We walked through the gate together. The steel gate slammed shut behind us with enough force to echo through the entire compound. I glanced over my shoulder without thinking. It was only a gate, but the sound of those heavy locks engaging crawled under my skin. Places like this could turn from sanctuary to prison in a single heartbeat. Ever since the world collapsed, my instincts had kept me alive, and they were already whispering that something here was off. Instead of admiring the buildings, I studied the defenses. The chain-link fence had been reinforced with welded sheets of scrap metal, and elevated platforms overlooked every entrance into the complex. Young guards patrolled the perimeter with rifles that were clean, well-maintained, and carried by people who moved like they'd been trained to follow orders without question. Whoever organized this place understood that walls didn't keep people alive. Control did. Parts of the compound were older than the residential buildings surrounding it. A faded federal sign near the main gate identified the property as a former Immigration and Customs Enforcement detention facility. The controlled entrances, reinforced fencing, observation platforms, and narrow checkpoints had already existed before the outbreak. As the settlement grew, the survivors fortified several neighboring apartment buildings and eventually enclosed the entire block behind one defensive perimeter. Only after convincing myself the infected would have a difficult time getting inside did I finally pay attention to the people living here. Children chased one another across the courtyard, though their laughter sounded strangely muted. Adults tended small vegetable gardens tucked between the apartment buildings. Laundry hung from balconies, tools were repaired at long folding tables, and the smell of hot food drifted through the cool afternoon air. For a brief moment, I caught myself remembering what ordinary life used to feel like. Sophie slowly turned in a circle, taking in the courtyard with wide eyes. Relief softened her voice when she admitted she had almost forgotten what normal looked like. I understood exactly what she meant, but I wasn't ready to let my guard down. I quietly reminded her that places like this usually came with rules, and sometimes the rules were far more dangerous than the people enforcing them. She managed a tired smile before telling me she'd gladly accept rules if it meant sleeping through a single night without listening for the dead outside. As we continued walking, nearly everyone greeted us with polite smiles and welcoming nods. On the surface, it looked like the kind of community every survivor dreamed of finding. But the longer I watched, the more something bothered me. People smiled when someone looked at them, but the moment they thought no one was watching, their faces fell blank. Conversations stopped whenever certain guards walked by. Even the children lowered their voices until the guards had passed. It wasn't fear. It was conditioning. The crowd quietly parted as an older man walked toward us. He wore simple work clothes instead of body armor, and unlike everyone else carrying a rifle, he wasn't armed at all. He didn't need to be. Every person who noticed him stepped aside without being asked. Their posture changed. Their eyes lowered. Their smiles sharpened into something too perfect. That silent obedience told me more than any title ever could. He introduced himself as Elijah and offered me a firm handshake. His voice was calm, warm, reassuring, the kind of voice people wanted to follow. He explained that his people had watched Sophie and me escape the horde outside the walls. He welcomed us without asking where we had come from or demanding anything in return. Instead, he told us that every exhausted traveler deserved a hot meal before answering questions. It was exactly the sort of kindness people wanted to believe still existed. I introduced myself and explained that Sophie was traveling with me. Elijah smiled kindly at her before leading us toward one of the neighboring apartment buildings that had been converted into a communal dining hall. Long tables filled the room, and dozens of residents quietly shared a meal together. The conversations were soft, almost peaceful, but every word sounded carefully chosen. 2 bowls of steaming stew were placed in front of us along with fresh water. Sophie looked at me before touching either one, silently asking permission. I gave her a small nod, and she wrapped both hands around the bowl before taking her first bite. Relief washed across her face like warmth returning to frozen skin. A young woman several tables away suddenly doubled over in a harsh coughing fit. 2 residents wearing simple white armbands quietly helped her to her feet and guided her toward a side hallway without a word. Almost nobody looked up. The conversations continued as though it happened every day. I took a cautious bite myself and realized the stew contained real vegetables and fresh meat. Someone had built more than a shelter here. They had built order. As we ate, I finally asked Elijah how he had managed to organize a place like this when most communities barely lasted a few weeks. He smiled patiently before explaining that he hadn't built it alone. According to him, the people had built the community together while God simply showed them the path forward. He spoke with the confidence of someone who had repeated the story many times, yet somehow it never sounded rehearsed. He explained that when civilization collapsed, most residents fled while he stayed behind to care for his elderly grandmother. The remaining neighbors prayed together, reinforced the walls, planted gardens, and slowly welcomed other survivors. Then his expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable, as he described the morning an infected wandered inside the complex. Instead of attacking immediately, Elijah claimed he had walked toward the creature carrying nothing more than a baseball bat. He said that when he looked into its lifeless eyes, he believed he saw the soul of the person still trapped beneath the disease. According to him, the infected simply stopped walking, stared back for several seconds, then quietly turned around and wandered away. Several residents nodded while he spoke as though they had witnessed the event themselves, or been told to. Elijah folded his hands together before calmly quoting from the book of Revelation about the pale horse whose rider was death. The room fell completely silent while he spoke. Nobody interrupted him. Nobody looked uncomfortable. They simply listened with complete attention. I couldn't decide whether I had just met the man who had saved these people, or the man who had convinced them that only he could. The silence lingered for several seconds after Elijah finished speaking. Nobody rushed back into conversation, and nobody questioned a single word he had said. The residents simply lowered their heads in unison before quietly returning to their meals. It didn't feel like the end of a speech. It felt like the end of a ritual. Sophie finished the last few bites of her stew before looking over at me. She admitted she couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten until she felt full. Hearing that reminded me how young she really was. Kids weren't supposed to treat a warm meal like a miracle. Elijah glanced across the dining hall and motioned toward an older teenage girl carrying folded blankets. He introduced her as Lily and explained that the community kept separate sleeping quarters for men and women. Lily would show Sophie where the girls slept while someone else prepared an empty apartment for me. Lily couldn't have been more than 17, but exhaustion had carved deep shadows beneath her eyes. She politely told Sophie to follow her. There was something off about her voice, too smooth, too practiced, like she was reciting words she'd been taught to say. Before leaving, Sophie looked at me with a question in her eyes. "I'll be around," I assured her. "Get some sleep if you can. You've earned at least one peaceful night." She smiled faintly before following Lily toward another apartment building. I watched them disappear across the courtyard. For reasons I couldn't explain, every instinct I had told me not to let Sophie out of my sight. I tried convincing myself I was overreacting. We'd spent days running from the infected, sleeping on cold ground, and barely surviving one disaster after another. Maybe I simply wasn't used to walls, warm food, and people who smiled anymore. Even so, I kept watching. Lily never looked back. Sophie did, twice, almost as though she wanted to make sure I was still there. Elijah excused himself shortly afterward, explaining that other responsibilities required his attention before nightfall. He told me someone would show me to an empty apartment once I was ready to rest, then shook my hand one final time before walking away through the courtyard. As he passed, something caught my attention. Every person he walked by smiled. Every single one. Then, almost immediately after he was gone, the smiles vanished, not slowly, not naturally, but instantly, like someone flipping a switch. It happened so suddenly most people wouldn't have noticed. Years of surviving had taught me to pay attention to the things people couldn't fake forever. Real happiness lingered. Forced happiness evaporated the moment the reason for it disappeared. I remained at the table, pretending to finish my meal while quietly studying the people around me. Nobody laughed loudly. Nobody argued. Nobody spoke above a calm murmur. Even the children played quietly, constantly glancing toward the adults as though they already understood invisible rules no one needed to explain. A chair scraped softly across the floor. An older man lowered himself into the seat with visible effort before offering a tired smile. Deep wrinkles surrounded his eyes, and his hands bore the scars of someone who had spent a lifetime doing hard labor. Unlike everyone else I'd seen since entering the compound, he didn't seem interested in pretending everything was perfect. He introduced himself as Isaac before quietly mentioning that he had seen the guards bring Sophie and me inside earlier that afternoon. I nodded. Isaac studied me for a long moment before asking a question that immediately put me on edge. "Is that little girl your daughter, or did you bring her here for another reason?" I stared at him without answering. The question didn't make any sense. Seeing the confusion on my face, Isaac quickly apologized and admitted he'd asked it the wrong way. He leaned a little closer across the table, lowering his voice until it was barely more than a breath. "Tell me something," he whispered. "Have you met the great prophet Elijah before today?" I shook my head. "No." Isaac slowly nodded, but the look in his eyes wasn't relief. It was fear. He glanced toward the courtyard to make sure nobody was watching us. Then he looked back at me. "Good," he said quietly, "because there's something you need to know before this night is over." Isaac waited until two residents finished walking past our table before speaking again. His eyes never stopped moving. Every few seconds he glanced toward the courtyard, then toward the stairwell, as though he expected someone to interrupt us at any moment. I had seen that kind of behavior before. People only watched the exits that carefully when they were afraid of being overheard. He leaned forward and lowered his voice until I could barely hear him. "You seem like a decent man," he whispered. "That's the only reason I'm taking this risk. If you care about that little girl, don't stay here any longer than you absolutely have to." His warning tightened something in my chest. I asked him what he meant, but Isaac didn't answer right away. He rubbed both hands together, the motion nervous and repetitive, like someone trying to warm themselves in a place that had grown cold long before the temperature dropped. Finally, he looked me directly in the eyes. "Everyone here calls Elijah a prophet," he said. "They believe God chose him to rebuild the world. Some truly believe it. Others learned life becomes much easier when they pretend they do." I remained silent and let him continue. "At first, this place really was a sanctuary," Isaac said. "People worked together because everyone wanted the same thing. We wanted to survive. Then the sermons became longer. The rules became stricter. Before long, nobody questioned Elijah anymore because questioning him meant questioning God." As Isaac spoke, I replayed everything I had noticed since walking through the gates. The forced smiles. The quiet conversations. The way children stopped playing whenever guards walked nearby. None of it had been accidental. Isaac's voice dropped even lower. "Elijah decides where everyone sleeps, who works together, who gets married, and who deserves extra food. Around here, every important decision somehow becomes God's decision." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "The young men carrying those rifles aren't soldiers. Most of them were preteens when the outbreak started. Elijah raised them, preached to them, and convinced them they were chosen to protect his kingdom. They would gladly die if he asked them to." I slowly looked across the courtyard toward one of the guard towers. The young man standing watch couldn't have been older than 19. He wasn't protecting the walls. He was protecting Elijah. Isaac noticed where I was looking. "They aren't bad kids," he said. "That's what makes it so tragic. They honestly believe they're doing the right thing." For several seconds neither of us spoke. Then Isaac said something that made my stomach tighten. The women don't have much of a choice here either. I looked back at him. He swallowed hard before continuing. Elijah believes he's rebuilding humanity one family at a time. He decides which women become wives and which men are worthy enough to have families. If someone refuses, Isaac paused, his jaw tightening. They usually disappear from the community and nobody ever asks where they went. I remembered Lily. I remembered the expression on her face when she came to collect Sophie. It hadn't been sadness. It had been resignation, the kind that comes from living under rules you can't escape. Isaac rubbed the gray stubble on his chin before speaking one last time. I can't prove everything people whisper about this place, he admitted. Rumors spread quickly after the world ends. Some people believe Elijah trades supplies with other settlements. Others think he trades people. I honestly don't know which stories are true anymore. He looked toward the building where Lily had taken Sophie. But I know this much, he whispered. If that little girl means anything to you, don't wait until morning. My pulse quickened. Every excuse I'd made for this place vanished at once. The walls weren't there to protect the residents. The guards weren't there to defend the community. The rules weren't there to preserve order. They were there to keep people in line. I had walked Sophie into a place that looked safe because it had learned how to hide its danger behind smiling faces and warm meals. As I stood from the table, only one thought remained in my mind. I wasn't leaving that apartment complex without Sophie. I left the dining hall without drawing attention to myself, but my mind was moving faster than my feet. Isaac's warning had changed everything. Only minutes earlier, I'd been thinking about getting a full night's sleep behind solid walls. Now I was planning how to get Sophie out of the apartment complex before anyone realized we were leaving. I resisted the urge to run straight toward the building where Lily had taken her. Panic gets people killed. If Isaac was telling the truth, the guards would notice the first sign that something was wrong. I forced myself to walk at the same steady pace as everyone else while quietly studying the courtyard for a second time. The entire place looked different now. Before speaking with Isaac, I had seen children playing and neighbors sharing food. Now I noticed how every guard could see at least two others at all times. Every pathway funneled toward a checkpoint. Every apartment building had only one obvious entrance. Even the residents seemed careful about where they stood, almost as though they had spent months learning which places were safe and which places were not. The community hadn't simply been organized. It had been engineered. I circled the courtyard once, pretending to admire the gardens while counting guards instead. There were more of them than I had first realized, and they rotated positions with unsettling precision. Nobody argued. Nobody wandered. Every movement looked rehearsed, like a performance they'd been trained to repeat. As I approached the building where Sophie had disappeared, one of the young guards stepped in front of the entrance. He couldn't have been older than 20, and despite the rifle slung across his chest, he still looked more like a frightened kid than a hardened soldier. He politely explained that the women's sleeping quarters were off limits after evening meal. His tone wasn't hostile, but it wasn't a request either. I smiled, apologized, and told him I only wanted to make sure Sophie had settled in safely. He returned the smile. Then he quietly shook his head. No exceptions. I thanked him and walked away without another word. The moment I rounded the corner of the building, my expression disappeared. Isaac had been right. Nobody had separated us by accident. They had separated us on purpose. As darkness settled over the apartment complex, lanterns flickered to life along the walkways. Their warm glow gave the courtyard an almost peaceful appearance, but I wasn't fooled anymore. The walls no longer looked protective. They looked confining. The smiling residents no longer looked comfortable. They looked exhausted, like people who had learned exactly how much they were allowed to show. Then I saw Lily. She stepped outside the building alone, carrying an empty basket toward the gardens. As she passed me, she kept her eyes fixed on the ground. Quietly, without slowing her pace, she whispered just enough for me to hear. "Don't let them keep her here." She continued walking as though nothing had happened. I never turned around. I didn't need to. That single sentence confirmed everything Isaac had told me, and everything I had already begun to fear. I slowly returned to the apartment Elijah's people had prepared for me. I closed the door behind me, sat on the edge of the bed, and spread my backpack across the floor. I checked my pistol. One full magazine. One round chambered. My hunting knife still sharp. Extra ammunition tucked into the side pocket. It wasn't much. It would have to be enough. I leaned against the wall and waited for the sounds of the community to quiet down. One by one, the conversations faded. Doors closed. Footsteps disappeared. Before long, The only sounds drifting through the apartment complex were the distant footsteps of the night guards making their rounds. Sleep never came. Every minute Sophie remained somewhere else inside that compound made me wonder whether I had already waited too long. Sometime after midnight, I stood, tightened the straps on my backpack, and quietly wrapped my hand around the doorknob. This time, I wasn't searching for supplies. I wasn't running from the infected. I was walking into a building full of people who smiled like neighbors and hid their darkness behind locked doors. No matter what waited for me on the other side of that hallway, I had already made my decision. I was bringing Sophie home, or neither of us was leaving that place alive. A few residents moved between buildings carrying buckets of water, while several guards changed shifts near the front gate. Everyone looked tired. Nobody paid much attention to me, which was exactly what I needed. Near the entrance to the building, I spotted the same young guard Elijah had assigned to escort me the night before. He looked barely old enough to shave. His uniform hung awkwardly on his thin frame, and the rifle slung across his shoulder looked heavier than he did. He noticed me approaching and offered a polite smile that didn't quite hide his nervousness. He greeted me quietly before explaining that Elijah had asked him to escort me to breakfast once I was awake. His voice remained respectful, almost apologetic, as though he hated giving orders that weren't his own. I smiled back. Then I stepped close enough that no one else could hear us. "I need you to answer one question honestly," I said. He nodded. "Where are you keeping Sophie?" Confusion crossed his face before he answered. He explained that the girls slept together in Building B for their own protection. He even began pointing toward the far side of the courtyard before realizing why I was asking. His expression changed immediately. Before he could react, I slid my pistol beneath his jacket and pressed the barrel firmly against his ribs. His entire body stiffened. I kept my voice calm. "Don't panic. Don't shout. Just listen carefully." The color drained from his face. "I don't want to kill you," I continued. "In fact, I'd rather nobody else got hurt today. You're going to walk me to Building B. You're going to help me get Sophie, and then you're going to walk away from this place alive. Whether that happens depends entirely on you." His breathing became shallow. After several seconds, he slowly nodded. I instructed him to remove the magazine from his rifle before carefully ejecting the round already sitting in the chamber. His hands shook so badly that the cartridge slipped from his fingers and bounced across the concrete walkway. He whispered an apology before picking it up. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Once the rifle was empty, I handed it back. "Keep carrying it," I told him. "If anyone looks our way, I want them thinking this is just another escort." He swallowed hard before quietly agreeing. We began walking across the courtyard together. From a distance, nothing looked unusual. A guard escorting a guest. Exactly what everyone expected to see. As we crossed between apartment buildings, I kept scanning rooftops, balconies, and windows. Years of surviving had taught me that the greatest threats usually weren't standing directly in front of you. They were waiting somewhere you hadn't thought to look. Without turning my head, I quietly asked which room Sophie had been assigned. The young guard admitted he didn't know the exact apartment number. He explained that all of the girls stayed together on the first floor, and Lily usually watched over them during the night. That answer bothered me. Children didn't need guards unless someone expected them to leave, or expected someone else to come for them. We rounded the corner toward Building B. Another teenage guard stood outside the entrance with his rifle resting lazily across his chest. He smiled the moment he recognized the young man walking beside me. Everything still looked normal. For about 3 more seconds. The guard outside Building B smiled as we approached, completely unaware that the rifle slung over Tim's shoulder was nothing more than dead weight. He greeted Tim with the casual confidence of someone expecting an ordinary morning and asked why he was bringing me back to the girls' quarters so early. Before Tim could answer, I pressed the pistol harder against his ribs beneath my jacket. Tim hesitated for only a second before forcing a nervous smile. He explained that Elijah wanted the traveler to say goodbye before leaving the compound. His voice cracked near the end of the sentence, but it was convincing enough. The second guard frowned. I wasn't told anything about that. I kept walking. The moment he shifted his attention from Tim to me, his hand instinctively moved toward his rifle. That was all the warning I needed. I grabbed the barrel before he could raise it and drove the butt of my pistol across his cheekbone. The crack echoed through the hallway like a gunshot. The teenager collapsed onto the concrete without firing a round. He let out a low groan before going limp. For a brief moment, I simply looked down at him. He wasn't a monster. He was another kid who had been taught to obey the wrong man. "Help me," I said quietly. Tim stared at the unconscious guard, frozen with fear. I said, "Help me." He finally nodded. Together we dragged the young guard inside the apartment and laid him against the wall where he would remain out of sight if anyone happened to glance through the doorway. The room fell completely silent. Dozens of frightened girls stared back at me from blankets spread across the floor. Some looked no older than 8 or 9. Others were teenagers who lowered their eyes the moment I looked in their direction. None of them spoke. They simply watched. The silence told me more than words ever could. These children had learned that speaking at the wrong time carried consequences. I turned back toward Tim. "I need you standing outside that door," I told him calmly. "If anyone comes this way, you warn me immediately. Don't try anything stupid. I don't want to shoot you, and I don't think you want to die protecting a man who wouldn't remember your name tomorrow." Tim looked like he wanted to argue. Instead, he quietly stepped back outside. I waited until the door closed before calling out, "Sophie." At first, nothing happened. Then I heard hurried footsteps somewhere deeper inside the apartment. A moment later, Sophie appeared in the hallway wearing the same oversized jacket she'd slept in the night before. The instant she saw me, the fear vanished from her face. She ran straight toward me. Without thinking, she wrapped both arms around my waist. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, she looked up and admitted she had been afraid I wasn't coming back. I smiled despite everything happening around us. "I told you I'd be around." She nodded before quietly confessing that something about this place had never felt right. Lily had been kind to her, but none of the girls smiled unless adults were watching. Some of them cried after the lights went out and nobody would explain why. I wasn't surprised. "We're leaving," I told her. "Right now." She glanced around the room at the other girls. "What about them?" The question hit harder than I expected. I looked across at the frightened faces staring back at us. I wanted to help every one of them. I couldn't. If I tried, none of us would make it out alive. I quietly admitted that I couldn't save everyone today. Sophie didn't argue. Instead, she lifted the back of her jacket and pulled the pistol I had given her from the waistband of her pants. I'd almost forgotten she still carried it. She walked over to one of the older girls and carefully placed the gun in her hands. "Be safe," Sophie told her. "And be bold." The girl stared down at the pistol before looking back at Sophie. Sophie gave her a small nod. "Only use it if you have to." Then she turned and followed me. I took her hand. "We're going home." She looked up at me with a confused expression before asking where home was anymore. I didn't have an answer, so I simply squeezed her hand. "For now," I said, "it's wherever we can stay alive." Together we stepped into the hallway. Tim was gone. The moment I stepped into the hallway, I knew something was wrong. The corridor was empty because Tim had disappeared. A second later, his voice tore across the apartment complex as he shouted for the guards. Doors flew open all around us, and the quiet sanctuary transformed into organized chaos. Young guards poured into the courtyard with rifles in their hands, some looking terrified while others looked determined. Most of them were nothing more than frightened teenagers trying to obey the only leader they had left. I grabbed Sophie's hand and quietly told her it was time to run. We burst through the doorway just as 2 guards rounded the corner. One hesitated the instant he recognized me, while the other immediately raised his rifle toward my chest. Survival had taught me never to hesitate first. I fired a single shot before he could pull the trigger, and the teenager stumbled backward before collapsing onto the pavement. His rifle clattered across the concrete, and the entire courtyard fell into stunned silence as everyone struggled to understand what had just happened. That silence lasted only a heartbeat. A scream ripped through the morning. Sophie tore her hand away from mine and sprinted toward the fallen guard before I could stop her. She dropped beside him, carefully turning his face toward the light. The moment she saw him, every ounce of color drained from her face. My stomach sank before she even spoke. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she struggled to force the words out. "Brandon, this is my brother." Everything around me seemed to disappear. For days, I had listened to her talk about finding him. I had watched her carry that faded photograph through forests, abandoned homes, and empty highways because she refused to believe he was gone. After everything we had survived together, I had found him, and I had killed him. The pistol suddenly felt heavier than it ever had before. I couldn't lower it. I couldn't apologize. There were no words capable of repairing what had just happened. Sophie wrapped her arms around her brother's body and cried with a kind of heartbreak I hoped I would never hear again. Nobody else moved. Even the guards seemed unsure whether to attack or simply watch. Then calm footsteps echoed across the courtyard. Elijah slowly emerged from between two apartment buildings with several armed followers walking behind him. Unlike everyone else, he wasn't rushing toward the violence. He approached with slow, confident steps and a peaceful smile that felt completely out of place. He raised one hand toward his followers, silently ordering them not to fire. "My friends," he called out calmly, "let's not allow grief to create even more tragedy." The rifles remained lowered. Elijah shifted his attention toward me before speaking in the same unsettling tone. "You have made a terrible mistake," he said. "Leave the girl here, surrender your weapon, and I will show mercy despite everything that has happened." I couldn't help laughing. It wasn't because I found anything amusing. It was because I finally understood exactly who he was. "You expect me to trust you after everything I've seen?" His smile widened ever so slightly. "I expect you to recognize when your fight is over." I slowly raised my pistol without taking my eyes off him. "My fight isn't over until I get an answer." He folded his hands together patiently. Elijah replied, "Ask me anything. I'm listening." "What is this place really?" I asked. "Why are you doing this to these people?" Elijah's expression barely changed. "Because the world needs order, Brandon." He slowly looked around the courtyard as though everything surrounding us proved his point. "Look beyond these walls. Governments collapsed. Laws disappeared. Families turned against one another. The dead walk among us while the living murder each other over canned food and clean water. You see an apocalypse. I see a cleansing." I stared at him. Elijah continued calmly. "Revelation tells us, 'Behold, I make all things new.'" People hear those words and imagine something beautiful. They forget that before something can be made new, the old must first pass away. He gestured toward the compound. "That is what we are witnessing. The old world is dying. What replaces it cannot be built on the same weakness that destroyed it." I glanced at the frightened people surrounding us. "So this is your idea of saving them?" "No," Elijah answered. "This is my responsibility." His voice never rose. "God chooses people for purposes they may not understand. I didn't ask for this burden, but I recognized the calling when it came. Someone has to restore order. Someone has to make decisions others are too frightened to make." His eyes moved briefly toward Sophie. "Sometimes those decisions appear cruel. Sometimes sacrifices must be made for the greater good. But the survival of humanity cannot depend upon whether every decision makes us comfortable." Something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. "So anything you do is justified because you think God told you to do it?" Elijah shook his head slowly. "You still think this is about me?" He stepped forward. "It is bigger than you, Brandon. It is bigger than me. I am simply doing what I was chosen to do. Those who accept that calling will help build what comes next. Those who stand against it serve the darkness that destroyed the old world, whether they realize it or not." That was when I finally understood him. Elijah wasn't pretending. He actually believed every word coming out of his mouth. Maybe he was a sociopath. Maybe he was so consumed by his own delusions that he could no longer separate God's will from whatever happened inside his own head. I didn't know. What I did know was worse. Elijah had created a world where he could never be wrong. If someone obeyed him, it proved he was chosen. If someone resisted him, they were doing the devil's work. If innocent people suffered because of his decisions, their suffering became sacrifice. And if someone got hurt along the way, he didn't have to feel guilty because he had already convinced himself it served something greater. You couldn't reason with a man like that. You couldn't appeal to his conscience. He had buried it beneath an illusion and called the illusion God. Sophie's brother suddenly twitched against the pavement. His fingers curled. His chest jerked violently. A wet, choking gasp escaped his throat as his empty eyes slowly opened once again. For one impossible second, nobody moved. Sophie's tears froze on her cheeks as she stared into her brother's pale, lifeless face. Hope flickered across her expression, fragile, desperate, because she believed he had somehow survived. I wanted to believe it too, but I had seen that look before. The dead didn't come back as the people they had once been. They came back hungry. Her brother's body convulsed again before his head snapped towards Sophie with unnatural speed. His cloudy eyes locked onto her, and a guttural growl escaped his throat. There was no recognition left in him. Whatever soul had once existed behind those eyes was gone. "Sophie, get away from him!" I shouted as I lunged forward. I was too late. He threw himself at her with terrifying force, knocking her onto the pavement. His teeth clamped into her forearm, tearing through her sleeve before I managed to grab him by the shoulders and yank him backward. Dark blood poured from the wound as Sophie screamed in agony, and I drove the barrel of my pistol against her brother's temple. The shot echoed across the courtyard. His body collapsed beside her for the second and final time. Silence lasted only an instant before Elijah calmly stepped forward. He looked down at the bodies without the slightest trace of grief. Instead, he almost seemed fascinated, as though he had just witnessed a prophecy unfold exactly as he expected. "You see," he said quietly, "death is only another doorway." I felt anger boiling inside me. "You call this salvation?" "I call it God's judgment," Elijah answered. "The weak perish. The chosen endure. Every soul here has a purpose, whether they understand it or not." I helped Sophie back onto her feet while wrapping my hand around her bleeding arm. Blood seeped steadily between my fingers, and I already knew what the bite meant. I refused to accept it, but deep down I understood. The infection had found her. Several of Elijah's followers slowly raised their rifles again. One nervous teenager looked toward Elijah before asking whether they should open fire. Elijah simply lifted one finger. "Not yet." His calmness frightened me more than the guns. He wanted us alive. That realization hit me harder than anything else. I leaned close to Sophie and quietly told her that when I started shooting, she needed to run without looking back. She shook her head almost immediately, insisting she wasn't leaving me again. I managed a tired smile despite everything happening around us. "Then stay close." Without another warning, I fired twice toward the group surrounding Elijah. The sudden gunfire sent everyone diving for cover as bullets ripped chunks from the concrete walls. Chaos exploded across the courtyard. Guards scattered in every direction, some returning fire while others desperately searched for cover behind abandoned vehicles and apartment pillars. I grabbed Sophie's hand, and together we sprinted toward the open front gate. Bullets cracked overhead. Concrete shattered beside our feet. Glass exploded from apartment windows as rounds tore through them. One teenager fired wildly without aiming, while another shouted for everyone to stop shooting because they might hit Elijah himself. The confusion bought us exactly the opening we needed. We burst through the front gate and disappeared into the empty streets beyond the compound. Behind us, angry voices echoed through the morning air, but none of them dared pursue us very far. Whether they feared the undead outside the walls or feared abandoning Elijah, I never knew. We kept running until the compound disappeared behind rows of abandoned buildings. Only then did Sophie stumble. She collapsed against the side of an empty storefront, breathing hard while clutching her injured arm. When I looked down, fresh blood was still dripping steadily from the bite. And for the first time since the world ended, I felt truly helpless. Neither of us searched for another excuse or another lie. We simply sat in the silence while rain tapped softly against the broken windows. Dust drifted through the pale afternoon light, and somewhere deeper inside the abandoned building an old ceiling panel groaned before settling again. For a few peaceful minutes, the ruined world outside seemed very far away. Sophie eventually admitted that she was growing tired, but she explained it wasn't the kind of exhaustion that sleep could fix. She said everything felt heavier with each passing minute, almost as though her body no longer belonged to her. I tightened the bandage around her arm even though I already knew it wouldn't change anything. Keeping my hands busy was easier than accepting the truth standing right in front of me. I told her that anyone would be exhausted after surviving everything we had endured together, but she smiled gently before explaining that I had never been very good at hiding the truth. Her words stayed with me because I knew she was right. After another long silence, Sophie looked toward the thin strip of gray daylight spilling through the broken boards covering the window. She quietly asked what life had been like before the apocalypse, and for several seconds I honestly didn't know how to answer. When I finally spoke, I admitted that before the world collapsed, I had spent years drifting through life without purpose. I blamed other people for my failures, convinced myself tomorrow would always give me another chance, and wasted more opportunities than I cared to remember. Ironically, it was only after civilization fell apart that I finally became the person I should have been all along. Sophie listened without interrupting. When I finished, she slowly shook her head and told me she didn't believe I had ever been a nobody. She reminded me that I had every opportunity to walk away from her, yet every single time I chose to come back instead. She said I kept insisting she wasn't my responsibility, but my actions had always told a different story. Before I could respond, she reached over and hooked her little finger around mine with a faint smile. I returned the gesture without hesitation, and together we quietly renewed our pinky promise. For one brief moment, it almost felt as though the apocalypse had loosened its grip on the world. Sophie leaned her head against my shoulder and thanked me for giving her hope, even if only for a little while. I told her she had given me something far more valuable than hope. She had reminded me that there were still people worth protecting, even in a world that seemed determined to destroy every good thing left inside it. She smiled one last time before quietly telling me that, regardless of what I believed about myself, I would always be her hero. I wanted to answer her. Instead, I sat beside her in silence while the rain continued falling outside, wishing that broken afternoon could last forever. Sophie's eyes fluttered once, twice, then slowly drifted shut. Her breathing faded into the ruined stillness around us, dissolving into the rain and dust as though the world was quietly reclaiming her. For a moment she looked peaceful, too peaceful for a place like this. I kept her hand in mine long after the warmth began to slip away. The building groaned again somewhere in the dark, a low, tired sound that felt almost like a warning. I knew what came next. I had seen it too many times. And Sophie, she had trusted me enough not to ask for anything more. I let go of her hand only when I had to. The muzzle flash lit the room for a single heartbeat, a brief, jagged streak of light that cracked through the shadows like distant lightning. The echo rolled through the empty halls, swallowed by the night almost as soon as it began. Then everything fell still. The rain kept tapping against the broken windows, but inside the building there was nothing. No groan, no whisper, no breath. Just silence. And for the first time since the world ended, I felt truly alone.